included in the museum collections of the Whitney Museum, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Museum of Contemporary Religious Art in St. Louis, and the St. Louis Art Museum, among others. Byron's work is characterized by a continuing interest in the nature of objects, specifically the theatrical nature of objects of contemplation, and a commitment to the practice of painting and collage with a strong parallel involvement with installation art. He has lived and worked in New York, Amsterdam, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and is currently a professor at Washington University in St. Louis. Please introduce our guest, Michael Byron.
Thank you, Professor Ooley, for that nice introduction. And by the way, I went to those 3 museums yesterday with the help of an MFA student who squired me around, and I had a great time. So if I were a student, I'd be there on Saturday. Oh boy. I want you to read this while I talk about some things. My background is probably fairly noticeable. I was born in the mid-1950s, which would make me kind of old. And as such, I was educated in an environment that identified artists in very specific roles. Painters, printmakers, photographers, sculptors. Then there were architects, there were curators and critics, and they all had a very specific badge that they wore. And I do consider myself a painter, but I don't always paint. I use other media to explore different combinations, and I'm particularly interested in how these things collage together. So thinking about creative makers in the 21st century, it became apparent to me that perhaps we needed to get rid of some of the old standing identifications. So this is my studio. This was a shot of the studio in the fall, right before I was going to have a show called The Syntax of Grayscale 2.0. And I want you to focus on this gray wall, because it'll show up again later. So to circle back to these ideas of different identifications, instead of painters, photographers and printmakers, graphic artists, graphic designers, anime people, I decided to make it bigger, make it simpler. And so I've divided it into 3 groups: visualists, volumists, and verbalists. I think of visualists as all those areas that people engage in. Visual, mostly 2-dimensional, but it can be 2-dimensional streaming, it can be 3-dimensional, it can be holographs. Volumists I think of mostly as architects and 3-dimensional sculptors, static sculpture. And then of course the verbalists, those are the people who write about all the stuff we make. And they tend to be curators, critics, theorists. And at one point, all of you will probably be engaging in one or more of these in your future. And it falls to you to really engage in your practice, because visualists in particular are going to be an important part of the 21st century understanding of information and experience, because we're bombarded by visuals all the time. I mean, we can think about work in terms of being a painter. For instance, this is a pair of paintings of mine from 1993, which I produced in Amsterdam when I was living there. But it has at its core all of the constituent parts that you as Core 1 design students need to deal with. You know, composition, color, scale, proportions. These are the things that are in every piece of artwork. Color, tone, value, the relationship between text and image, which is apparent here. And these things remain constant regardless of the media that you choose to work in. So these are two paintings. People sit and watch and people sit and worry. And they were part of 4 paintings that were in the 1993 Corcoran Biennial in Washington, D.C. Now notice the white background just turned gray. Wow. Anyway, the reason I bring up a gray background is here we have the comparative effects of what the background, like the wall in my studio, has on viewing a work of art or some visual consideration that you'll be producing. So here's an example of what happens between a white wall with objects on it and a gray wall with objects, the same objects. So on the left, you see that the highlights, that the highlights here drop out. And if you look over here, particularly in the wedding gown here, this becomes the highest highlights. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about display strategies. Color in the architectural surround really has a lot of effect on your work. You know, my studio investigations are pretty wide-ranging. This one is sort of, these two are sort of prototypes of what I call collage thinking, in that both of the images in the 2 paintings were found from 19th century political cartoons. And the text and images, the text is from me, but the application of them is done with vinyl. This was an early vinyl exercise for me. And then the framing. The framing is very, I'm going to get this right. The framing is very important. So top to bottom, side to side, and then contained with this thin blue line that acts as a frame. So I have a very wide studio practice. I explore material interactions, as I kind of explained, media implications, content delivery strategies, and the nature of objects made for contemplation. But one thing that I'm not interested in is stylistic branding. It's not a great strategy, but it gives me a lot of freedom in terms of the range of things that I'm interested in. So for me, the process of making work can be very spontaneous and immediate, or very deliberate and focused, depending on the task at hand. So the thinking, preparation, and methodology can be very different from project to project. And I'm not going to show you everything because, as old as I am, I've produced a lot of stuff, and I don't want you to fall asleep because we don't have that much time. But, and I am an advocate of using failure as a creative force, as a potential area of investigation in your work, and also the idea of circling around and doing something again. So I'll go over some work from the last 20 years. It'll move by like a flash. So what might be a seemingly big diversion from those first paintings that you saw, people sit and whatever, actually it's somewhat similar. The red rectangle, skewed rectangle, tends to act as the text, and then the background, which is in oil paint, tends to be sort of the narrative atmosphere. It's not really a narrative or a subject, but it's atmosphere. These are called constellations. And when you put a red square on a field of bubbles, I realized pretty quickly you could do it forever. So I began to look for little prompts that would give the viewer some kind of connection. So the name of this painting is Constellation Spanish Galleon, and I guess it's because that looks like a whale and that looks like a porpoise. You got to find a hook. You have to find a hook. That's really the way it works. So thinking about all the infinite variations that one could have putting a red rectangle on these sort of atmospheric fields, I began to think about something more tangible for the viewer to latch onto. So I started thinking about these as portraits. These are, the one on the left is called Constellation Ganesh, and the one on the right is Constellation Hanuman, they're both Hindu gods, and if you look long enough, you'll find the monkey. Then I kind of moved into 20th century icons, cultural icons. On the left is a painting called Constellation Buckminster Fuller, and then sort of his counterpoint from the sciences into the psychedelics is portrait of Timothy Leary. But I began to think that I needed to get back to some figuration. So this technique of the bubbles led me to this series called the Grisaille series. And the technique is created, that illusionistic bubble pattern is created by a long session in the studio using oil paint to capture and reanimate black and white photographs of sculpture. And the range of those goes from 20th century modernist sculpture to power objects to objects I made. And so they have to be done while they're all wet. So it's 6 to 8 hours in the studio. And then once they're wet, they're laid down horizontally. The water is introduced to the surface. It beads up, sort of like oil and vinegar salad dressing. And then I introduce spray paint. So at the bottom is always the darkest value. Then there's two mid reflective shadows and middle tones, and then the top is white. What happens is that film sits on top of the wet oil paint, and it actually adheres to the oil paint, and the water evaporates, which is makes my life a lot easier. But people are often disappointed that I don't paint them all by hand. So these are, I've shown you a piece by Picasso. This is an interest I have in the 18th century French portrait sculptor named Houdon. He was the portrait sculptor of most of the founding fathers of the United States and all of the French intellectuals of the time. So on the left we have General Lafayette, who has his name in towns all across America. He was a French general who helped us during the American Revolution. And on the right is Robert Fulton, who happened to be in Paris during the negotiations between the Americans and the English at the end of the Revolution. And he, interestingly enough, actually started out as a portrait painter and then got involved in science and helped the steam engine become popular mode of power. And you can see this on a lot of paddle wheel ships. I also get, people give me stuff. Somebody gave me this object in 1986. It's a gorilla skull packed in mud, wrapped in a basket. So I decided that after a few years, maybe I should just do a portrait of it. As kind of custodian of this object, I felt it was sort of my duty to at least paint a picture of it. Some of the subjects I paint, I find in museums. And I actually was looking pretty hard yesterday in Dallas for some things to paint. This is called, this is a piece from Papua New Guinea, and it's called Abelman. And this is the largest grisaille painting I've done to date. It's 5.5 by 4 feet. It took me about 14 hours in the studio. And here's a picture of it at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And I actually have developed this potentially creepy, but I think kind of sweet habit of visiting these things whenever I'm in a city where I know that it's somewhere. So I have a whole route of things that when I'm in Paris, I go visit this one object that I've painted from there. The series is kind of one that flows through all of my work. So this is a picture of two of them from 2013 in a show in Cleveland. But the problem with doing these gray paintings is that after a while, they get to be a little monotonous, and they led me to a whole different series of works just so I could use color and be a little less tethered to a very procedural set of strategies within the work. So in 2001, I bought a notebook. I keep a lot of notebooks, and this one was a handmade notebook. Maybe it was 40 years old when I got it. And the binding broke. And there were 250 pages in it. And I thought, damn, what am I going to do now? I've got all these pages without a binder. So I decided that while I was doing these grisaille paintings, I would set up a system where I would do something to each page, didn't matter what, and I would take a picture of it, whether it was successful or not. And so it took me about 1.5 years to do this. And it's called the Ameton Notebook Project. So there are 55 examples from this series of 245. They constitute the master suite. But having photographed them all in slide form, I burned all the others. And I kept the ashes. And I guess here's where, the idea of harnessing the potential, the creative potential of failure comes into play. Here's the ashes. They're in a little glass carafe with the title of the series etched on it. And then behind this curtain, you get to see all the ones that didn't make it. So there's like 150 of those. And this was shown at what would become the Contemporary Art Museum of St. Louis. And so here's some of the individual works. Now I tried to do as wide a range of things as possible. So on the left, that's sort of an early digital print of a model that I was trying to get someone to finance. It's called the Infinite Corridor, where you close 2 mirrored doors, and in doing so you create infinity. The other one is just a snapshot of a candle that I made. Random stacks and numbers, these things I was interested in setting up systems that were totally random. So the one on the left actually became a sculptural project using a computer program where sets of dates would be scrambled by the computer. And on the right is just obsessive drawing. Here's a couple more. The one on the left is pretty traditional collage, although I did run this part right here is a photograph from a train convention, model trains, which I then printed over glue, which ruined my printer and made my wife very mad. But the one on the left, this one's kind of important. This was in the project, and I thought of it as a visual piece of artwork, but in fact it was really a way for me to think about the creative process. So if you look at these, you kind of get an idea of where things start, where they develop, and how they sort of get past doubt. And so it became a much more central notion of the creative process. And I use this a lot in explaining the steps in which I think visualists go through in making their work. So in 2008, I switched over to doing a focused investigation into these framed abstractions. So all of the what you're looking at is a full canvas composition. So the frames around them are actually painted on the canvas. And I find that this kind of abstraction is much harder to do because it doesn't have a system to support it other than the frameworks. These were done based on different experiences that I've encountered. The one on the left was from a show of Hindu gods again. That's another Hanuman. That was done in Indian miniatures, and this is in response to a show of Papua New Guinea sculptures. Here's two paintings that actually have the same title. It's called The Reluctant Pinata, number 2 and number 3. And the one on the left is a real painting. The one on the right is a kind of real painting, in that the center of it is actually a digital print on canvas from one of my own small works on paper that was blown up to about 5 feet. But the thing that gives it some legitimacy in terms of being a painting is that in fact the frame is painted. So I began to think about the potential of digital media in relationship to traditional paintings, and here's a couple more of those. These are from 2009, 2010. But at the same time, I've been very interested in doing collages. It's, that collage thinking that I talked about with those two paintings, people sit and watch, became more manifest and more present in the work, and it was a way to make work while I was traveling. I got a grant in 2009 to go to India to pursue this project called the Elephanta Project, which is an investigation of the elephant in Indian visual art and in the fabric of the culture. So I went there, and I thought I'd be just collecting things and photographing stuff, but it got so hot during the day that I spent most of my time after 2 o'clock in my hotel room. So I started doing collages. So here's my studio. This is in Udaipur. This is just a hotel room. So with a box cutter, pair of scissors, and a ruler, I started collecting a lot of kids' books, local newspapers, different medical texts were very interesting, and started putting together a series of these small collages in these kids' unlined notebooks. And they range from being kind of humorous to being kind of political. This is an interesting moment in this kid's book. Right here. This was in 2009, so all these people are in play at that time. And it's interesting how they frame this. These are some great politicians. Write their names. So, and then they have a big rat problem there. So it was easy to insert the humorous with the political and the social. And so I began to take, I had pictures of things out in the world that I was very interested in, like these taxis. And then I would find a representation of them, and they have great yellow pages there. They're a little behind. They still believe in the yellow pages, or at least they did in 2009. I don't know what they do now. I found that they were doing some very interesting stuff, trying to make these really small elephants. And I think they're trying to keep that a secret. These 3 kids I met in a park, and you could get your picture taken with them. They were dressed as Hindu gods. And I left actually it was the same town as the one of the hotel shot in Udaipur. And I came back about 3 weeks later and I was looking in the newspaper, and lo and behold, who do I find but these kids again? And so I decided to insert them in a front piece from a book on Indian history. So you see there was a kind of a back and forth between regular photography, regular media, older antiquity kind of material, and then the daily newspaper. So I applied that same kind of idea to a trip I did in 2013. I was really interested in the European currency problem, particularly as it affected places like Spain. So these are a series of collages I did over a period of a couple of months. The one on the left is from Paris, and the one on the right is from Barcelona. And it was about this time I decided to get rid of people's heads, because once you identify the person, particularly if they're a politician, you kind of lose control of the narrative. So that's the German chancellor, who was in the paper every day I was there. And then there were some, this is from Paris, the one on the left, and it looks like I put the same one in twice. These are from Barcelona. And these are some, those were traditional collages. They were all side-to-side cut, kind of quilted together, just glued and very immediate glue stick, spray adhesive. These are different. These are done originally as traditional collages, and then they're scanned and blown up. These are both from 2014. And I wanted to explore, maybe you are familiar with the term Foley artists. They're the ones who make sound effects before sound effects became digitalized. So I wanted to do a tribute to Foley artists. So the only real connective tissue in this series is that there's an ear in every one of them. And this is still going on. There's probably about 100 of these now. So I kind of want to circle back to that original shot that we had of my studio. On the top left is a traditional collage, and on the right is a traditional collage that's been turned into a grayscale and then blown up. And on the left is a small notebook collage that will also go through the same process. That's about 9 inches tall and 7.5 inches wide, and it's all from the New York Times. Same thing for the one on the right. And then I decided to put them through this digital phase again. And this is the studio prior to the show. So that you can get a sense of the scale. They're about 7 or 8 feet tall, and then there is an inserted grisaille painting on top of it to sort of activate the background in terms of its visual materialist personality. So here's the shell, and it includes a larger version of this is called Showtime. I found out if you put dogs or cats in paintings, people really like them. So just keep that in mind. And these are some traditional grisailles that kind of accompany it. This is a very large, unattended constellation. It doesn't have any locators in it. And if you notice, the walls are painted gray. When I told the gallerist we had to paint them gray, he was a little disappointed. And he said, "Really? We can't keep the gallery nice and white?" And I said, "No, that's not going to work. You'll have to come to my studio." And he came and took one look at that gray wall I mentioned and said, "Okay, I get it." So remember Constellation Buckminster Fuller. This is another version of it. And this is a piece called Buckminster Fuller Goes to Versailles in 1964. I don't think Buckminster Fuller ever went to Versailles. I think he went to France, but I don't think he ever got further than Paris. So, and it's about 8 feet tall. And there's a larger view of Showtime. I was really taken by the fact of all these people trying to take a picture of this little dog. I guess it's at the Westminster Abbey Dog Show in New York. I keep really huge files of newspaper photographs, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why newspapers and not something else in a minute. So here's another one called Frontier in the Promised Land. Use a lot of images of people taking pictures of things we don't see, and hand gestures, political hand gestures. This is a more classical one. It's called Easel and Awning. And you probably saw that around somewhere. That's someone standing in the gallery to give you a sense of scale. This is not technically part of that series, but it's the beginning of a new body of work called How to Build a Ghost. And instead of using digital renditioning of collages, I decided to use all real materials. So those two silver blankets are the kind of they're the type of blanket that's used by firefighters, forest firefighters, that they cover themselves. And then there's an army blanket and an abstract painting on top of it. Now, the thing about collage, at least from my point of view, is that it is really incredibly elastic. It's able to make things that seem really disparate come together and create some surprising narratives. Once they're put together in a way that the viewer recognizes as deliberate, they tend to have a lot more authority, or they have a level of authority that makes you wonder what they're about. But I'm interested in the fact that newspapers, which I know are going to be obsolete in the near future, have some physical relationships that don't exist digitally. In other words, you have an image on one side of the page, and then the back side of the page there's another image, or sometimes on the same page there's two images that seem to be totally disconnected, but once you cut them out, once you sort of liberate them from the page, they have a whole new sense of identity and meaning. And I call these the found collages, and they only exist in printed matter. You can't manufacture these. So here's one. Nearly all that had to happen here is for me to recognize that there was a potential here. Get out an X-Acto knife, and then put them together. So this is the stage of the painting, the collage on the front of the page. So there's Dorothy meeting the Wizard of Oz. But what's on the back side created a whole new interesting reaction. If you look at Dorothy and her cohort there, they seem really surprised. But if they only knew what was on the back of the page, they'd be even more surprised. And that is, sort of a clear example of what I think of as found collage, that there's a lot of magic out there if you're willing to kind of look in the dark corners of the newspaper and look at context, content, and composition by eliminating everything that's intended for you to see. And that just about brings me to the end. So thank you. And I'll answer any questions that you might have.
Now's your time to ask questions. We still have 2 minutes.
They told me I had to do it in 40 minutes. I did it in 38, so please ask me some questions.
The first constellation piece that you ever did, how did you get the inspiration to create that imagery with that? Like, what caused that?
Did everyone hear the question? What was the inspiration for doing the first constellation piece? The two paintings before it were sort of the immediate predecessors of my thinking about how do I move away from, how do I get out of my comfort zone? That was the big thing. I mean, I've been working in that method for about 10 years. And so that bubble technique I found by mistake.
Okay.
It was discovered trying to create another technique. And then when I saw what happened, I realized that I could sort of break it down and put some logic to it by introducing those different volumetrically descriptive tones to the bubbles. So when I did that, I realized I had pretty much a clean slate, and then the idea of the text became just a red rectangle. And then it went from there for about a year. And then I realized I got kind of maxed out on it.
It's a really cool style.
Thank you.
It's amazing.
Thank you. Yeah.
When physically making your collages, how do you drop like the opacity of certain layers that you're making them? Like in that example right there,
Yeah.
there's several things that look kind of glued together but don't have full opacity. It's not like 100%.
Right.
How do you make that like
Happen?
In the real world?
In the real world?
Like Photoshop?
Yeah, I'm a Luddite in Photoshop. I can kind of resize things and make them a little more vivid. But what I went back to an old technique. By the way, I made that on Sunday just for you guys. That's Dapper Dennis, the marionette. What I did was I made the traditional collage, and then I started printing. I printed an image of him on vellum. So there are two images of him on vellum that are sandwiched over this traditional, edge-to-edge glued collage. And now what I could probably do is go back into Photoshop and pump up a couple of little things and then print them as a third iteration of it, third generation. So it's really handmade, but I mean there is a little digital manipulation, but I don't even know how to layer. So.
I was going to say, one way you can physically do it in the real world is by using oil. So if you do a print on just regular paper and then saturate it with
Right. The thing that I found about that is that what you get, if you want that state to be something that is archival, that tends to get a little tricky. But yeah, when I use things that have to dry, I usually take a picture. Yes?
Did you find anything at the Dallas Museum that you loved?
Well, I was there about 3 years ago. This tells you how old I am. I was there in 2009, and I saw a print of a white elephant, and I thought, I went looking for it, but it wasn't up. Well, you can find out what I looked at on my Instagram account. I do have that. My gallerist made me do that. It's Michael_J_Byron_studio. Yeah, there's some pictures of the Nasher, and there's an incredible stone crystal sphere at the Asian Museum, the Crew Asian Museum, and it creates a camera lucida, so everything's upside down when you look through it. I've never seen that before. But I didn't find any grisaille subjects this time. But I'm always looking.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you.